Now, one of the challenges I had in trying to put these ideas in a condensed form for this evening's talk is that there's a lot of talk about resistance in the first section of Seminar 1. And there's a lot of things we could say about it, but I think the bottom line takeaway point here comes with a quote which happens in about the second section of that seminar when Lacan says, from Freud's initial researches, resistance is linked to the idea of the ego. So his critique of the ego, as we see it develop in multiple layers, is also a critique of how people have thought about resistance and the interpretation of resistance and potentially the overcoming of resistance. So just to keep that idea in mind, we'll say a little bit more about that. And then at around the same section of the seminar, he goes on to offer a definition of counter-transference, which, as I've already kind of suggested, and as soon becomes clear, cannot for him be used as an instrument of analysis or interpretation. So here's his little definition. He says, the counter-transference is nothing other than the sum total of the analyst's prejudices. I should just say two things here. Number one, we often have this notion that for Lacan, the whole concept of counter-transference should be dismissed. And I think that's not quite right. Lacan is very skeptical and critical of certain ways that this concept is operationalized in the clinic. And we'll say a little bit about that. But it would be wrong to say that he dismisses the concept out of hand. I think Bruce Fink also makes that point, actually. This is a useful concept, but he's very wary about how it has often been utilized. He makes one further comment about speech, ego, counter-transference that I just want to mention before moving on. He said, speech is that which, he says there's different forms of speech that become apparent within analysis. One of those forms is speech in which, here's the quote, the subject might be given access to that part that has been of the subject separated from their history. Sorry for the slightly jumbled way of putting that, but that part of the subject separated from their history, that's one way he would approach the unconscious, that part of the subject that has been separated from their history, almost as if there's a gap in the subject's ability to take up or engage with part of what they have been, part of what their history is. So let's then just make a couple of points about the ego and then maybe clarify the critique of counter-transference. I mean, maybe people know this stuff already, but it's sometimes helpful just to reiterate that. There are a few condensed comments, speculative comments and criticisms on how the notion of the ego has been used in analysis. Now, of course, you could say that Lacan's not going to develop that in Seminar 1 because that's the topic of the whole of Seminar 2. But one crucial point here, I think, helps orient us to what's going on. Lacan seems to constantly want to avoid situating himself in a way that thinks the ego in a substantive sense. Okay, he wants to separate himself from ego grasp as somehow substantial. We might say then that his stance here is to position himself relative to the ego as it presents as a technical challenge, which is a kind of nice reorientation to how would we situate ourselves with certain Freudian concepts. Not the ego as a substantive thing, but the ego as technical challenge. Here he makes the comment, the ego has a foundational role linked to technical necessities. So isn't that interesting? Like one way of utilizing ego is not to fall into the illusion that the ego is substance, but rather to think about how the ego presents multiple technical challenges to the work at hand. And just to maybe contextualize that idea, much later, well, not much, 10 years later, in Seminar 11, there's that famous pronouncement that Lacan makes when he says, the status of the unconscious is not ontological, but it's ethical. Another one of those reverberating aphorisms that we can wonder what it means and how to apply it. But I think it's kind of useful because we could, in an odd sort of way, just speculatively, just bracketing one idea at a time here, we could say that a similar logic perhaps pertains to how we think the ego. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the ego is not something to be ontologized, surreptitiously ontologized, explicitly ontologized. It's rather an ethical challenge, which is to say, when we talk about an ethical challenge, a treatment challenge. And I think that a similar logic of how we would think about the unconscious, not as an ontological thing, but as ethical, by which I think Lacan means as a mode of the realization of the subject, as a means of thinking treatment, as a means of thinking psychoanalysis as a practice. I think similarly that logic could be said to apply to the ego. The ego then is not an ally to the work of analysis. Rather, it's a defensive formation whose various productions are symptomatic of an order of unrealized truth or desire. Now, it's difficult to know exactly how much exposure different people have had to Lacanian theory, so I don't know if this point's obvious or not, but I suppose you could say it's worthwhile emphasizing, because once again, it's very counterintuitive. The ego is the decoy mechanism. The ego is the illusion. The ego is the gestalt, the mirage that gets in the way of analytical work. It's not the thing to be strengthened and supported for Lacan. It's part of the problem. That second session of the seminar then ends with a series of thoughts on the shortcomings of a variety of psychoanalytic modes. Historically, shortcoming of hypnotism, but Lacan wants to push forward this idea that often, if there's a form of analysis which somehow broaches or somehow gets close to a form of suggestion, that for him is no longer psychoanalysis. And he insinuates that interpretations of the defenses can be a kind of power move on the part of an analyst, maybe particularly if handled badly, but he goes on to say that the analysis, interpretation of defenses can give us a sense of the analyst having won a victory. And he speaks of the danger of forcing the subject through the analyst's intervention. Okay, so I am just keeping an eye on the time. Maybe I'm just going to try and cut out one or two thoughts here. But as he moves into the third session of that seminar, he says something else which is crucial and which hopefully builds on some of the puzzle pieces we've started to put together. He says, the subject's meaning must not be revealed to him or her. It must be assumed by him or her. Continues, if anything constitutes the originality of the analytic treatment, it's to have perceived the problematic relation of the subject to him or herself, a relationship with the meaning of their symptoms. Now, this is another one of those points where I think initially that sounds kind of obvious, like we already know that. But I think it introduces a shift and a crucial difference in emphasis. And we could do that, we could dramatize that point by making reference to how Lacan thinks the difference between imaginary transference, or how he understands the notion of imaginary transference, and symbolic transference. What do these two things mean? Imaginary transference is when the projections, the unconscious transferences occur on the person of the analyst themselves. This is an unavoidable aspect of psychoanalysis, so it's not something one can reduce. But Lacan's idea is that what's more productive is not simply for the subject to get hung up on their transferences onto the figure of the analyst. And of course, we all remember now Freud's comments that the transference is both the vehicle of the treatment, but also it's one of its most pronounced limitations. For Lacan, what's preferable is that although that part of the transference is presumably unavoidable, the real dimension of transference, where it can be most clinically operative, is the transference that is occurring between the analysand and their own productions, their own speech, their own dreams, their own symptoms, their own symbolic utterances. And that's where the analyst should position themselves, not as the recipient of the transferences of the patient, although to some extent that's unavoidable, but rather as the person that facilitates the work of encouraging the analysand, who is analyzing, who's doing the analysis to all intents and purposes, of their own contents. So that's a point that'll come up again and again. I'll emphasize it again just before we conclude. And it also helps us start to grasp then how it's not simply a dyadic relationship for Lacan, but that there's a triadic kind of role that we should try to facilitate in clinical work. So to reiterate, one does not use one's ego as an instrument of the treatment if you're the analyst. One doesn't work with a client or foreground the relational factor of your ego in its engagement with the patient's ego. at least not for Lacan. I know lots of people do. Lacanian psychoanalysis, by contrast then, is not really primarily a relational treatment. It's more akin to the analyst taking a step back and facilitating the work of the analysand's analysis of their own symptoms, of their words, of their dreams. Another way of making the same point is to say, who is the other that the patient or the analysand needs to contend with? Who is the other that they engage with in their treatment? Of course, at some level, you could say, well, it's the transferential figure of the analyst themselves. But if we stay at that level, says Lacan, we'll never move far enough. In other words, the other that they engage with is not simply the analysand themselves, but it should be the analysand's own other. Sorry, I think I made a mistake when I said that. The other that the analysand is engaging shouldn't simply be the figure of the analyst, but it should be the analysand's own other. In other words, their speech, their symbolic productions, their symptoms. He now moves on to making, so we've seen he's had one argument against the idea of a two-person psychology. In fact, I've just made that point, right? But another prevailing orthodoxy in psychoanalysis at the time, and maybe still today, is the idea that one should focus the analysis. It's an object relations idea. And I should note all the way through, I, for one, I like trying to teach the Lacanian stuff. I like trying to do it. But I try to also bear in mind that this is a critique and that there may be situations where some of these ideas, object relations or whatever, are actually kind of helpful or useful. Certainly being a supervisor, one realizes that, I think. But nevertheless, here's his next critique. He takes the idea that one should work with and refer to the here and now of the clinical situation. He says that a famous case of the analyst Margaret Little exemplifies this, where time and time again, the clinician refers to the here and now of the relationship and what's going on in the clinical engagement. He then offers a critique of how counter-transference is sometimes used. So, and just to say, interestingly, if you read the text carefully, what he's doing is not an outright rejection of counter-transference, a point that I've already made. He even suggests that in the case he's analyzing, that some of how countertransference is being used is some of what is picked up, so-called, in the countertransference is very possibly accurate, right? But he doesn't think that it should be used analytically. So I want to just give that passage so we can get a sense of what he's saying. The analyst believes themselves to be authorized to offer what I will call an interpretation from ego to ego. In other words, an interpretation whose foundation and mechanism cannot in any way be distinguished from that of a projection. In other words, I'm using an experience, a state of affect, something that I'm feeling here and now, as a way, that's a clinical instrument almost, as a way of recognizing something that the other person in the room is unconsciously putting into me, is communicating with me. The state of my ego thus becomes an interpretive modality, an interpretive form for grasping what is going on unconsciously with the other person. This kind of more Kleinian idea is something that he's taking issue with. And he's basically saying that in that moment, and again, I'm not saying it's never had its clinical uses or utility. I've had lots of people talk about it and say how powerful it can be. But for Lacan, that always opens up a huge margin of error, and not just a margin of error, it opens up the prospect that one as a clinician is fundamentally using projection as a way of trying to grapple with what you think your client is going through. He continues, it's best to abstain from offering this interpretation of a defense. He's now also thinking about two problems in clinical technique for him. A constant preoccupation with interpreting the defenses of your patient, and the use of countertransference as a way of mounting interpretations and comments. It's best to abstain from offering this interpretation of the defense, which I call from ego to ego. In the interpretation of defenses, there should always be at least the third term. Okay, we've seen that already.